Well, Secretary, I think you just got a cheer there. Actually makes you a rock star. Well, thank you, Susan, for that very kind introduction. On behalf of the Financial Times, I am delighted and honored to be here today with two people who are some of the wisest voices on the world, on foreign affairs, the future of diplomacy, and the past out there on the world stage. And I'm particularly delighted because I must say this is one of the few times when I've been on a panel with three women and not talking about gender affairs. Isn't that great? We are the FT, that is indeed pink, and this takes pink power to a new level. So, now, we are going to be talking today, and I should briefly introduce you, we barely need any introduction, Madeleine Albright, the 64th Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, your advisor, an advisor to Bill Clinton, and also the first Secretary of State, Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs under President Obama, someone who did the Iran deal as well in 2015. But we're going to be talking about the future of diplomacy. We're also going to be talking a bit about the past. You've both written these fascinating books. Wendy Sherman's book, which has just been published, is called Not for the Faint of Heart. That lays out your own career and your thoughts about the tough world that is diplomacy today. Secretary Albright's book, Fascism, A Warning, which is, as it says on the cover, it's in bright red in case you don't get the point. They both lay out some very challenging points about where you've both come from, the path that you've trodden, and where we're going. But before we talk about the future, we are talking today at a moment when obviously we need to think about history. Many of you will have watched the extraordinarily moving oratories today at the 41st President's funeral. It was indeed a time that's made many of us reflect on what it means to be American, what it means to be in the world today, what America stands for. But aside from that, we have quite a special anniversary today, which almost nobody else in the room knows about, apart from you, Secretary of State. Would you like to tell us about it? What happened 22 years ago, out of the blue, to you?
Well, it began the day before today, 22 years ago, when I got a phone call. I was ambassador at the United Nations from Erskine Bowles, who was the chief of staff to President Clinton. And he said, if the President of the United States were to call you tomorrow, would you take the call?
And so just tell us, how did you answer?
Yeah, I'll have to think about it. And then if he were to ask you to be Secretary of State, would you say yes? So to both, I obviously said yes. And he said, go back to Washington.
Did you have to think about that?
No, not a second. Because, frankly, if I could say this, it was clear Secretary Christopher wasn't going to stay for a second term. So there was the great mentioning. And what happened was people said a woman could never be Secretary of State because Arab leaders would not deal with a woman. So then the Arab ambassadors at the UN got together and said, we had no problems dealing with Ambassador Albright. We wouldn't have any problems dealing with Secretary Albright. So then somebody else at the White House, and I never want to know who, said, yes, Madeleine's on the list, but she's second tier. So my name had kind of been out there. So
and you never found out, or you're being too diplomatic?
No, I never did find out. I didn't want to know. So what happened was he said, why don't you go back to Washington? The president will call you in the morning. So I was so freaked, and I...
Did you sleep that night?
No. And I forgot I was dealing with President Clinton because I got up early. I didn't even take a shower, sat there in my pink bathrobe. And Elaine Shokus, who was my chief of staff, I'd asked her to stay the night. And I said, he's changed his mind. He's definitely changed his mind. And so finally the phone rings, and they said, this is the White House operator, hold for the President of the United States. And then they put on some terrible music. And then I thought, he definitely has changed his mind. And then he said, will you be Secretary of State? And I, of course, said yes. And he said, well, get dressed, come down, we're going to announce it today. So that is what happened 22 years ago.
Wow. Now, one of the things I find amazing and moving about this story is not just you telling the story about the phone call, but the fact that obviously when the phone call came, you were the first ever female Secretary of State. And yet, I met you a few years ago in Aspen at a barbecue party. You were wearing a cowboy hat. And I had my daughters with me. And I introduced them. They were blown away to meet you. And you turned around and said to them, well, isn't it funny? Because these days, my own granddaughters say to me, I don't know what's so special about having a female Secretary of State. They're all female.
That's exactly. My granddaughter, 8 years ago, when she was 7, said, so what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State. And in that time, it was true. In her lifetime of Condi and Hillary. And then since then, I've said there are a lot of little boys who are now encouraged by Secretary Kerry and Secretary Pompeo.
Well, isn't it an astonishing sign of how the world has changed? Now, tell us about you. How did you enter diplomacy?
I entered diplomacy in a very strange and peculiar way. Secretary Albright and I have known each other a very long time, and we've known each other largely through politics. When the secretary was Geraldine Ferraro's national security advisor during the campaign, when she was the vice presidential candidate, the first woman to be on a national ticket. I was then the chief of staff to then Congresswoman Barbara Mikulski, who was a co-chair of the Mondale-Ferraro campaign. So Madeleine and I did a lot of things together. And then for the Dukakis '88 campaign, the secretary became Michael Dukakis' national security advisor, and I ran Washington operations for Dukakis. So we were both in Washington. I ended up running the general election for him. That was not so great. Not in September, everybody answered my calls in Washington. By October, no one answered my calls in Washington. But nonetheless, we did a lot of things together in Washington, became very good friends. But I was still doing politics, and I was a partner in a Democratic media consulting firm. On a Sunday night at home having dinner with some friends, and I got a phone call from a guy named Tom Donnellan, who then was a lawyer at O'Melveny & Myers, and one of his partners, whom he didn't know, named Warren Christopher, was going to become Secretary of State, and Tom was going to become his chief of staff. As you know, Tom went on to become Barack Obama's national security advisor. So Tom said, Warren Christopher would like to see you tomorrow. And I said, why? Well, he would like to see you. It was Martin Luther King's birthday, and I figured, what the heck? And I would say to every particularly young person out there, I wish you such an unexpected life. The best things have come when I didn't expect them at all. And so I went and saw Chris the next day, and he said, if the president agrees, I'd like you to be the assistant secretary for legislative affairs for the State Department. And I said to him, well, if you want someone who knows everything there is to know about national security and foreign policy, I know something, because you can't do campaigns without knowing something, but I'm not Madeleine Albright.
Right.
But if you want someone who knows Washington, perhaps. And so I indeed was nominated and confirmed. And then when my dear friend and political colleague, Madeleine Albright, became the first woman Secretary of State, I was honored by her asking me to be her counselor.
Right.
Yep.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to get some flavor of that life story is because when we look at the world today and think back over the last few decades, the path that you've trodden, you know, in some ways we're looking at a world which has seen extraordinary progress. I mean, the fact that an 8-year-old can think that all Secretary of States are women is astonishing if you look back over the last few centuries. And yet, we also live at a moment right now when some aspects of that progress are, if not sliding backwards, But we're seeing a world where we have many, many bad news stories, not just good news stories. We see populism rising, we see polarization, tribalism on the geopolitical stage, a lot of dangers. And your book, Fascism, A Warning, is very much born out of your own experience, your life experience, coming from Eastern Europe, because your own family knows what fascism means. They've seen what happens when populism and polarization and tribalism explodes. How concerned are you about the world today, Secretary Albright?
I am concerned. Some people think the book is alarming. It's supposed to be. Because I went back and I did a lot of research in the history of fascism in order to really understand what are the kind of conditions that bring it. And Mussolini was the first fascist. And it came in Italy after World War I, when in fact the Italians were disappointed in what they got out of the war. There were a lot of divisions going on, a lot of questions about where the country was going. In fact, they had a number of prime ministers and changes all the time. And Mussolini was a smart young man who, in fact, kind of was an outsider who wanted to do something about it. And he thought that he was a stable genius. And so
How do you say that in Italian? Can you imagine with the hands waving, a stable genius?
No, but it's even there. I really did a lot of interesting research in terms of what he said. And they started a party called Fascists, and fasces are actually kind of a symbol that we have on a dime, frankly, that are these rods with an axe with them. And so there was a party that was created. And what happened is Mussolini comes into power. He said he wanted to drain the swamp. And
he actually used those words?
Yes. And then what happened, and I think the part that is very interesting and came also as a result of research, both he and Hitler came to power constitutionally, because the things that were going on in Italy were worrisome to King Emmanuel, and he asked Mussolini to take over. And so I think that is a part that has to be noted. And in Hitler's case, Germany was going through all the Weimar Republic problems and financial things. And von Hindenburg asked him to take over. Franco, same thing. There had been problems. I then write about some of the things that are going on now, whether it's in Poland or Hungary or Philippines or Venezuela, Turkey. All those people were elected. And I think that is why I started looking at what the conditions were when people are dissatisfied, when there is a leader who is willing to identify himself with one group against others. And in fact, instead of trying to find common ground, really makes the divisions even stronger. And one of the best quote in the whole book is from Mussolini, who said, "If you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices." And there's a lot of feather plucking going on right now. And you can't say those two words together too quickly.
So bottom line, is America sliding into fascism?
No, I think that I'm concerned about some of the things that are going on in terms of the divisions being exacerbated, and concerns about the disarray that creates and the divisions that are there, and the fact that I'm deep, not just because I'm looking at you and I love the FT, I do think that what is being said about the press, because the role of information and media is absolutely essential in order to have the truth out there. So that is what worries me.
Thank you. This isn't a commercial for the FT, but thank you anyway. Wendy, what about you? Because, as someone who's both looked at the political side of Washington and the foreign policy side, do you see signs that America's sliding towards fascism?
I don't think we're sliding toward fascism, but I am very concerned about the movement towards autocracy, of a person leading our country. We all spent some part of today probably watching the funeral of George H.W. Bush. And I'm a Democrat, And I didn't agree with some of the things that he did, and certainly didn't agree with some of the things that Bush 43 did in terms of the Iraq War. But he was a man who had a character of believing that he should do what is right for the country. He had a sense of history, and he had a vision for the future. And autocrats don't care about history, and they don't really have a vision for the future. It's about what I need right now for my power to be strong. The trend that's happening around the world is a trend that's actually been going on for some time. And it's really an anxiety about modernity. It's about an anxiety of losing control. It's an anxiety that the world that I might once have known doesn't exist anymore. And one of the ways that I explain it is, even though I am married to a white guy who I love dearly, that 55-year-old white guy in the middle of the United States, or the guy in Hungary or Poland, or the guy who voted for Brexit in Great Britain, doesn't feel like it's his world anymore. His manufacturing job has probably gone, not so much to trade, maybe to technology. His wife is at work, and he didn't want his wife to work. He has to put his kids through college. Healthcare costs a whole lot. He doesn't understand the world at all. It's social, it's cultural, it's economic. And the gap between the 1% and the rest, and the gap between the 20% and the 80% has grown during the last 2.5 years, right, during the Trump administration. So it's not that we can go back to the world of George H.W. Bush. That world doesn't exist anymore. The world's moving much faster than that pace. But we all have to worry about sliding into the divisions that the Secretary talked about, and sliding into grabbing onto fear when, in fact, we should grab onto hope.
Right. By the way, I should mention, I forgot to mention before, if any of you want to ask a question, there are people going around with collecting cards with questions on them, so do write down a question if you'd like.
Can I just tag on to that? Those divisions, then, you find a demagogue who, instead of trying to mend these problems and look for solutions, actually turns one group against another and then finds a scapegoat, the other, to blame. And that is the kind of thing that's going on, especially in terms of issues of immigration and some of the other trends. So I think, I'm asked sometimes, as you did, not whether we're going to fascism, but whether Trump is a fascist. I don't think he is, but I think he's the least democratic president in modern American history.
So what does that mean for America's role on the world stage? Because, again, as we saw in today's moving tributes, there was a time when America felt very strongly that it was a beacon of values on the world stage. And you might disagree with some of the things the 41st president did, or you may not. But there was no question at that time that America aspired to have a leading role on the world stage. Has it lost it?
I don't think we have lost it. I think our leader has lost it. But I don't think America has lost it. We're sitting here next to someone who came to this country as a refugee. And I had a conversation this afternoon with the president of the board of the 92nd Y, Lawrence Belfer, whose father was a refugee. And people who come to this country in those circumstances, because I've heard the secretary talk about this a good deal, have a passion for the freedom of this country, the values of this country, what this country stands for. And I don't believe that's gone at all. And I think the world wants us to be that. Everywhere I travel in the world, and we all three of us travel a great deal, people say, we will help, we will follow, we will do our part, but we need America to lead. There is no other country that not only has the economic resources, or the military resources for that matter, or the political resources, but the values that America has, all in one package. So we may be at a moment in time where we doubt who we are going to be on the world stage, but I don't have any doubt we're going to reclaim that role, working with others, not working alone.
So, Secretary Albright, let's imagine we were in a sci-fi movie where suddenly you were transported back to become Secretary of State again, okay? With or without the current president. What would you do to recreate America's role on the world stage? Do you think you can?
I do think it could be done, and I think Wendy's the one that's been in negotiations most recently, and there's no question that if the United States doesn't say or do something, then things don't happen. It doesn't mean you have to be the first one to speak, but you have to be there in order to point the direction. And I would make clear that America is stronger when we have friends and allies. By the way, I might resurrect the word multilateralism. Americans don't like the word because it has too many syllables and it ends in an ism. But it's basically just partnership, because I think that Americans and others would accept if we treated others as our partners, as you did in the Iranian talks, you need to strengthen the position of a force multiplier by being a partner, but I think people are looking for American leadership. The thing that has to happen first, however, is we need to explain to the American people that we are better off when we have partners and are not doing things alone, and that, in fact, it strengthens all of us, and not do, when I'm troubled by the many things that are going on, us going around saying that we're victims. We're not victims. We're the most powerful country in the world, and we need to play that role and try to figure out how to bring others along and not threaten them. And the title of this, Does Diplomacy Have a Future? Through diplomacy. And you've been doing it most recently. So I do think, but I do think it has to be, I tried desperately to make foreign policy less foreign, that it is not just about dealing with a bunch of foreigners, but it's about basically how we are able to provide what we need for our own people by working with others.
And yet in the current environment, when we do have this autocracy, this polarization rising, it's very hard to start arguing in favor of a calm, rational, reasoned foreign policy. I mean, one thing that always strikes me, I don't know if you've seen the amazing chart that Bridgewater put out a couple of years ago looking at populism across the Western world since 1900. And it shows that if you look at the proportion of the vote that went to populist candidates after 1929, after the crash, it jumped up from around 10% to about 40%. And then it stopped because you had World War II. High populism sparked war. Post-World War II, that chart went back down again to 10%, and it stayed at 10% until 2010, and now it's back at the same level as it was in the 1930s.
I think there is reason to be concerned.
Is that going to lead to war?
That we could find ourselves at war. I think we could find ourselves in an Arab-Persian war. I think we could find ourselves in war in Asia. I think there's a lot of reason to believe neither of those things will happen, because I think there are sober minds that will try, and we now have some checks and balances back in the Congress that hopefully will try to right the ship. I don't think it's healthy for democracy for any one party to have the reins of the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And so I think what happened in the midterms elections was a very positive thing. But there's a lot of work to do, and we can keep stoking these divisions, and we've seen what happened to the stock market yesterday. You know this better than any of us do, Gillian. And if indeed we are headed toward a recession, that very situation may happen, where the president believes that he needs to create the situation that will get us out of a very bad time. And unfortunately, sometimes that has meant war in our country.
I mean, the amazing thing is that populism has exploded in the last 8 years in a similar fashion to the 1930s, but the 1930s was in a recession/depression. Populism in the West has exploded at a time of growth. What's going to happen when we have a recession?
Indeed.
I have to say, and again, Wendy mentioned the funeral today. We're never going to can't recreate what was, but I think that we cannot operate on the basis that we have to be afraid all the time. I am very concerned about always raising the fear factor. because then that becomes kind of a propaganda aspect, and people then are so depressed that they are not thinking in a positive way. So I'm often asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot, which is actually why I wrote the book, so that I think that there really are ways that the signs have to be out there. And, you know, we all know the saying, see something, say something. I now have added to that, do something. And we can't just moan and groan about this. We are, you know, populism has a very bad connotation, but actually it's people trying to do something. If really operating in some way that is positive. And I think, first of all, we have to talk about the role of freedom of the press. You're not the enemy of the people. You are the ones that are reflecting and talking about what is going on and providing us with information. Then we cannot have leaders who think that they're above the law. And then what has to happen is we have to figure out a way where people run for office. I'm very excited about what just happened in these elections. Not just the number of women that are now members of Congress, but really that the voter numbers went up and people thought about it. Then I really do think that what we have to do, and this is hard, is talk to people with whom we disagree. I don't like the word tolerance because that's tolerate, put up with. I think we need to respect other people's views and try to figure out why they are thinking what they're thinking. And then there isn't a book or a speech that's ever been written that doesn't quote Robert Frost. So my favorite quote, and I have in the book, is that the older I get, the younger are my teachers. And therefore I feel that we should be looking at what the young people are doing. When I was writing the book, it was right after Parkland, and I really thought that the young high schoolers going out and marching and calling for town hall meetings. I teach at Georgetown now, and I do a lot of work with students. They are the ones that we need to support, figure out where they're going, and we have to do something. We can't just sit around and moan and groan about this. We have to do it. It's up to us.
Well, absolutely, and of course you're teaching at Harvard as well. But when we look at the world stage, what region worries you most? I mean, if there is a risk of war looming, what are you particularly concerned about? Is it the Middle East? Is it China?
For me, it's both of those in different ways. China is a rising power and an incredibly important one. And on the one hand, the Chinese, through what they have done, have reduced poverty in their country by probably 30% at this point. That's really quite an achievement. On the other hand, it's a somewhat repressive society. It doesn't play by the international rules. It tries to play by its own rules and has a tremendous amount of patience, as we've seen in the recent trade negotiations that took place. I think they understand quite well that they can wait out the President of the United States and gain the upper hand. So it is important that China have to play by the rules, but what we need to do is do what the Secretary said, which is join with our European allies, work on pushing back on China to agree to those rules, help the countries in the ASEAN region, the Asian and South Asian nations to come together. They don't want to have to choose between the United States and China. So there's an enormous amount of work to do. And of course, the President of the United States has fallen in love with the head of North Korea.
Well, this month.
This month. And
I mean, we just had revelations that North Korea maybe
today.
Just, those of you who haven't yet logged onto the FT.com website, there are revelations about, more nuclear
more missile sites and nuclear sites. And, this, just as a digression here for a second, the fact that John Bolton said that the president has to have another summit with the North Koreans because the North Koreans haven't kept their commitments from the first summit. That just belies common sense as a negotiator. So just doesn't make any sense. So I'm very concerned about China, and we need China to help on North Korea.
Well, I'm going to talk about China in just a moment. Before I do, though, as someone who negotiated with Iran, which country do you think is more likely to get a nuclear weapon first, Iran or North Korea? What worries you more?
Well, North Korea already has nuclear weapons, has many nuclear weapons. Iran has never had a nuclear weapon. And if the president had kept the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in place, we only come up with bad names for agreements, but that's the name of the Iran nuclear agreement. I think Iran would not be able to get a nuclear weapon, which was the whole point of the negotiation.
Do you think it's going to get one now?
I think that they are hanging on by their fingertips because the Europeans are trying to hold on to the agreement. Russia and China are holding on to the agreement. I think they're waiting to see if the president will be up for another 4 years after these 4 years. I think a lot of the world is doing that, and when you ask the secretary whether we could get back to the kind of diplomacy that can solve problems and whether we could recreate our alliances, I think if the president is president for 2 more years, yes, we can. If the president is president for 6 years, listening to the speech that Secretary Pompeo just gave in Brussels, where he denounced the European Union, he denounced the UN.
The UN, multilateralism.
WTO, multilateralism, pretty much everything. Then it very much concerns me the world will be quite a different place after 6 more years of this.
Yes, in fact, we have a question about this, which has just been answered, so thank you, whoever answered that. That's great. On the issue of China, there was a very influential book that came out a couple of years ago from Graham Allison, your colleague in Harvard, called The Thucydides Trap, which is about as hard to pronounce if you have a lisp as plucking feathers. But the Thucydides Trap basically argued that whenever in history you've had a strong incumbent power and a rising power, I think he went through 20 cases where that had happened in history and pointed out that 16 of them had ended up in massive war. Do you think that US and China is heading for the Thucydides Trap? I wish he'd call his book another name.
I think there is a danger of that, but I've just come back from China, and what I find interesting is they are not without their problems, and partially I have said that sometimes when there are problems, nationalism is kind of raised as a way of getting people focused and wanting to get them exercised about something, and Xi Jinping is doing that with the Chinese. I think saying they have been not respected and humiliated by the world, and it's now China's time. I think that what is going on in the trade talks is very dangerous, but what truly worries me is not so much the Thucydides trap, but an accident in the South China Sea. And because we've already seen in terms of where some freighter is close to a fishing boat or something, and the military-to-military relationship is very fragile. And the question is whether there are enough diplomats out there now in order to kind of calm the waters. And the part that is really nuts is that most of our, we don't have enough diplomats. The State Department is populated. We do have an ambassador in China, but we don't have enough diplomats. And what Wendy said is absolutely right. You don't begin with a summit. You begin with a lot of diplomatic work and laying the groundwork, and that isn't taking place. So I am worried about an accident to do with the Chinese, and to some extent also an accident in the Middle East, because there are an awful lot of moving parts to that. Even I, and I bet you, Wendy, you read the morning papers and you really have to try to figure out who's on whose side today in the Middle East. Yep. Various Kurds on one side and the Syrians, et cetera, and it's unbelievably complicated, and not enough attention is being paid. There's just a denouncing of the other.
And I would say it's gotten all the more complicated, not only because of the horrific Yemen war and the humanitarian disaster that is Yemen, but the role that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has definitely played in the horrific murder of Jamil Khashoggi. Yeah. And when we have Putin, who poisons people outside of Russia, and Saudi Arabia that murders journalists outside of Saudi Arabia, let alone inside their countries, we're in a really very difficult place. The relationship with Saudi Arabia has been important to the United States in the Middle East, and I don't think anybody wants to give it up entirely. I don't think that would be wise of us in terms of our security. but there has to be accountability and there has to be a price that's paid, or we have sent a message all over the world that leaders anywhere can kill anyone with impunity, journalists in particular, and further say that freedom of speech is to be killed.
Well, indeed. Which brings me on to another question from the audience. What action would you advise the US take against Saudi, given the balance of power in the region and with Iran?
I think we need to keep calling for more investigations. I think that I would not be for breaking off relations with Saudi Arabia. I happen to actually believe that we need to have relations with every country, that it's not a gift to have diplomatic relations. And Wendy and I have talked about this often, is the fact that we haven't had diplomatic relations with the Iranians means that we didn't know a lot of what was going on. And not even who the people were for a long time. And so it is the bread and butter in terms of just trying to talk to a country. But I do think that arms sales is not the way to go. They're really in kind of our relationship being for sale. And I think the Yemen story is also part of that. What I find interesting, and to go back to something that Wendy had been talking about earlier, I find what the senators were just doing, both on Yemen and also being just appalled at the testimony that Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mattis gave to them on what was happening with Saudi Arabia, and that even though, frankly, by Republican senators who were appalled at what was going on, Senator Graham and Senator Corker, that I think we need to look more at what is happening with our Congress. And I've said it's Article 1 time. And we really need to understand that there are these checks and balances in place and worry about the fact that there might be an accident, but also trying to work on diplomatic. Really, the title of this talk, diplomacy is absolutely essential for every country and for the United States.
You know, one of the things I try to talk about in Not for the Faint of Heart, and the reason it's called that is because diplomacy is not for the faint of heart. It is not soft. I adore Joe Nye, who came up with the concept of soft power, meaning non-military power. But I know that Joe did not mean for it to be ineffectual. In fact, diplomacy done right is tough and smart, is usually backed up by a credible threat of force, but a threat you never want to have to make real. It is very hard work, but it gets results, and war should be the absolute last resort. You know, many of the people in this audience, certainly I had parents who were involved in World War II, and my father fought at Guadalcanal, and he and my mother were at the founding of the United Nations because he was still a Marine. You're always a Marine, but he was still a Marine, and he didn't want there to be war ever again. And John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State at the end of the Iran talks, when all of the foreign ministers were in a room by themselves with the Iranian foreign minister and the small core delegation, and each foreign minister, along with their political directors, which was my role, and each minister got to say a few words, and the United States was last, and Kerry spoke the words we had written for him. But then he let the piece of paper drop to the table. And he talked about going off to the Vietnam War when he was 24, enlisting, and then coming back to protest that very war. And his voice trembled and his eyes welled up. And he said, "So for me, that's what this agreement is about. No more war." And even the Iranians applauded.
Which brings me very nicely to one of the other questions from the audience. With the US out of the Iran nuclear deal, do you believe the Trump administration will attempt to take military action against Iran?
I think they are beating the drums very hard. There was a confirmation hearing for the person who is a foreign service officer who is going to be nominated to be the ambassador to Yemen. A really tough job. And he spent most of the time talking about how horrible the Iranians were, to the point where several of the senators got irritated because Yemen is not all about Iran. It's about an internal civil war that, yes, is now supported by Iran, but that's not how it started. And I think that we've heard from Secretary Pompeo all of the things Iran must do before there's any conversation. And it's really at the top of the charts for the administration, in part because President Obama was for having a relationship, and so therefore I think the administration's intent on doing just the opposite. So yes, it does concern me that there is a drumbeat that could, as the Secretary said, find us, maybe not intentionally, at war.
Secretary, you obviously dealt with Russia at length. How do you assess Vladimir Putin and where Russia is going? Are they just irritants? Are they seriously malevolent? Is that a distraction? I mean, out of this horrible array of challenges right now, where do you put Russia next to North Korea and Iran and Saudi?
Well, it's interesting. In the national security strategy, Russia has been put as an equivalent to China as a threat, which I actually think is a gift to Putin because they are not of that level. But they are clearly, just flat out, Putin is a KGB agent. He knows exactly how to do things. He is somebody that has weaponized information, has not only interfered in our elections, but has interfered in what's been going on with our allies, and he is very good at that. There's no question about it, and we kind of ignored it for a long time. I think the part that scares me a lot is that President Trump is not paying attention to that because he thinks that it undermines the legitimacy of his election. I am willing to say he was legitimately elected by the Electoral College. So let's get on with trying to deal with the Russian threat, because I think that is a real thing. And what they've just done in Ukraine, we're supposed to be paying attention on that, and I do think that President Trump did say that was what he was, why he was not meeting with Putin, though they did. But I am worried about what Russia's doing, because as when they're poisoning people, they are doing all kinds of things. They are not on the level of China, but they are malevolent. And Putin is, he has played a weak hand brilliantly. And he has done it in the Middle East,
Absolutely.
where all of a sudden they had been players before. We managed to not have them be players for a long time. They're back being players in terms of having a relationship with the Syrians and with the Saudis and a number of different places. And I don't think we have put their position up there with the Chinese, which I think is wrong, but we are not paying attention to exactly the kinds of things they're doing to undermine our countries and separate our allies from us.
What about cyber? We have a question here about what on earth are nation states going to do to address the misbehavior in the gray zone of cyber, the little green men problem. I mean, that wasn't such an issue 20 years ago, but do you see any effective way that a country like America can deal with a cyber threat?
Well, I think we do have to do more in having a cyber policy, but we also need to do something to develop some new rules. And part of the issue, Gillian, we've talked about kind of the dissipation of the system. There are a number of institutional structures that we have now that's what Pompeo did, discard them. I do think we need to develop some rules of the game. Very hard for the U.S. to do that at this point, since we're pulling out of the INF Treaty and doing all kinds of things to undermine a kind of a rules-based order. But cyber is very dangerous. There's a whole question about, can you have a deterrent to it? Should we be involved in using cyber ourselves offensively, not just defensively? And I think there are not enough people who understand what it's about, and I do think that there needs to be more attention paid everywhere. And the public and one more thing, it really does involve the public and private sector working together on it, which is not the easiest thing.
Well, I must say, we've had cyber training this week at the FT, and it's terrifying when you look at what is out there, and it really requires a level of education and awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. President Macron just held a peace forum in Paris on the anniversary of the armistice of World War I. And one of the tracks was on cyber peace, on digital peace. And the Secretary and I, besides everything we do in national security and foreign policy, also are business women and work for some of the folks that are trying to get international norms for cyber, because I think even the technology companies know that there need to be rules of the road. I suspect there will be some regulation of technology companies that are coming down to try to put some borders around what they do. But not only cyber, Gillian, but artificial intelligence is of enormous concern. And I don't think there's a government in the world that's doing all of the forward planning they need to do around artificial intelligence, so that the job dislocations that we've seen because of trade and technology in our lifetime will be nothing compared to artificial intelligence. And so both cybersecurity, the good use of the internet, as well as technology, but we also have to think through the downsides and try to anticipate them a heck of a lot better.
I want to come back again to the women thing, the female factor. Do you think women do diplomacy differently from men?
Two answers to that. One of the things that I learned from this very wise woman to my left when I started getting very involved in national security and foreign policy, and have done it ever since that fateful call from Tom Donilon, is that when you sit at a negotiating table, you are less Wendy Sherman, a woman, and in my case, an American Jew, which was important, sitting opposite Iranians, and North Koreans have no idea what that is. But you are more than anything the United States of America. And that's an incredibly powerful position. And I think if one takes hold of that power, it's a really remarkable and marvelous thing. Being the only woman in a room can sometimes be difficult, to say the least. And having support of other women is absolutely essential. I think that Secretary Albright did two things that were equally important when she became Secretary of State, if I may say so, about personnel. For her undersecretaries and deputy secretaries, almost all, not all, but almost all were men. And in part, that was to say that she was very comfortable having strong men around her. The people who were her personal staff, who were her counselor, her chief of staff, were women. Because I think that you knew that we would provide you the support you needed. We'd tell you the truth. We'd tell you when you need to put your lipstick back on. We could go in the ladies' room and have a conversation nobody else would hear. And that those things are important. So having that support is critical. And acknowledging the last quick story I'll tell, acknowledging the difficult things that come with that. When I negotiated with Iranians, they were all men. They could not shake my hand. They are conservative Muslim society, and they could not shake my hand. And wanting to find common ground, one of the chapters in the book is on common ground, I tried to think of how I could deal with that. Women have a workaround. We go like this. But if you're in a room full of men and you go like this, you begin to look like a Marx Brothers routine after a while. So I told my counterparts, Abbas Arachi and Majid Ravanchi, that I'd grown up in a Jewish community and among Orthodox Jews, and those men couldn't shake my hand either. At first, they were somewhat mortified by the conversation. As you may know, Iran believes Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth, and the Holocaust didn't happen. So, but it was a very important conversation to try to find a way around the differences and to find common ground.
That is certainly diplomacy in action, in every sense, about finding bridges. Secretary Albright, I'm curious because, Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the IMF, sometimes jokes that if we had had Lehman sisters instead of Lehman brothers, they wouldn't have gone bust.
Yeah.
if we had more women as Secretary of States, not just in America but in other countries, would we not be teetering towards war?
I think we would be trying to find solutions and putting ourselves into the other country's shoes. I think women are much better at doing that. I also think that in many ways one can do two things, is to be yourself, but also be very tough. I think you can surprise people. I had a trick, frankly. I would go abroad and we'd have our normal conversations, and then I would say, I have come a long way, so I must be frank. And then I really told them everything that I thought. I could get away with it. And I do think that there is a way to be able to use the skills that women have, I think, in trying to find common ground, but at the same time, to be very honest. I also do think, as Wendy said, it helps a lot if there are other women. So when I first got to the UN in 1993, there were 183 members of the UN. It was one of the first times that I didn't have to make lunch myself. So I said to my assistant, would you invite the other women permanent representatives for lunch? So I get to my apartment, and there are 6 other women there out of that number. Canada, Philippines, Kazakhstan, Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, and Liechtenstein.
Good old Liechtenstein.
Right. And because I was the American, I created a caucus, and we called ourselves the G7.
The only time in history when Kazakhstan and Liechtenstein have been part of the
G7. And we agreed that we would always take each other's telephone calls, which meant that some man, our permanent representative, came up to me and said, why are you talking to Liechtenstein when you could be talking to me? And I said, well, have yourself replaced by a woman and everything will be fine. But I also, then when I was Secretary of State, I created a group of women foreign ministers. And then it's been enlarged so that now when there's more than, it's the same thing always about not being the only woman in the room. And if you have women secretaries of defense and a number of different groupings that can make a difference within their own countries, I think it makes a difference. And getting women elected to parliaments in other countries, yes, it makes a difference. Plus, when I was secretary, I'm the first one that actually put women's issues central to American foreign policy. Not just because I'm a feminist, but because I knew that when women, half the population in every country, are politically and economically empowered, the societies are more stable. So let's go for it.
Yeah. Well, it's been a fabulous conversation, both provocative and moving, and I think, frankly, challenging for everyone here in the room. As you said earlier, Secretary Albright, we can't go back to the days of George Bush when America had a clear vision of its role on the world stage, when people thought they knew what diplomacy meant. And in many ways, we are living through very challenging, dark times when almost everything is being questioned. And yet, the fact is, we're sitting here on a stage with 3 women talking about foreign policy in a way that would have seemed inconceivable, never mind 500 years ago, 50 years ago. We're sitting here 22 years after you got that extraordinary phone call as the first female Secretary of State, and at a time when there are more women than ever in Congress. Change and progress is possible in ways that people don't always understand. And I think, I can speak for all of us, that you have really set out a beacon for what can be done with a committed vision of change and progress that's very inspiring for all of us. And I'm going to
say it's very inspiring what you are doing.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I mean, you have an incredibly important job. And the whole issue about the role of the media and your job in terms of management as well as writing, I think you deserve a lot of credit for what you do.
Thank you. That's very kind. But I'm going to end with the last question I got, which is very relevant to both that and what you just said. Would you tell us about your pin, your collection of pins? famous collection of pins is up there with RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, wonderful neck collars. If any of you haven't yet seen the RBG documentary,
Spectacular.
go home and watch it now. It is just spectacular. But someone asked what your pin is, and I can actually give the answer, which is very relevant. Your pin tonight is for Mercury, the messenger. We in the FT and the media are proud and humbled to try and play our role as messengers today, but I think you both have presented an extraordinary message, both in your books and on the platform, which both upholds the best of American values, but also the challenge to all of us in upholding them going forward. So thank you.
Thank
you. Thank you, Gillian.